Hey, welcome to Thinking is Contagious. I'm going to do something I normally don't do. I'm going to read you an article. It came out in Forbes magazine. It was sent to me by a friend of mine, and it's by John Tamney, who's a contributor. And it starts off, says, it's great that so many have copies of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, but very unfortunate that so few have read it. The alleged supply chain problems we're enduring right now were explained by Smith in the book's opening pages. Smith wrote about a pin factory, and then remarkable truth that one man in the factory working alone could maybe produce one pin each day. But several men working together could produce tens of thousands. Work divided is what enables the very work specialization that drives enormous productivity. If this was true in the 18th century pin factory, imagine how vivid the truth is today. Figure that something as basic as the creation of a pencil is a consequence of global cooperation. So what kind of remarkable global symmetry leads to the creation of an airplane, a car, or a computer? The kind that can't be planned in short answer, but more realistically, the only answer. Please keep this in mind as you read media coverage of the so-called supply chain disruptions, resulting in shortages that are said to be causing inflation. If you want a bigger laugh, read about what President Biden wants to do in order to get the supply back on the market, with an eye on replenishing U.S. retail shelves that are increasingly bare. He's decreed in his brilliance 24-hour port operation. Yes, thanks to the 46th president, we now know what held the Soviets back and ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union. Their ports weren't open long enough, thus the shortage of everything. All of the above would be funny if it weren't so sad. Media members, experts, economists, and politicians don't even disappoint anymore. To say they do would be to flatter them. Either they think we have inflation, shortages, or a combination of both. Wrong on both counts. Really? Who was talking about supply chain shortages or the impossibility that is demand-driven inflation in early 2020? Very few were. And that's because the U.S. economy was largely a free economy then. This is the critical point of this article. The U.S. economy was a free economy at that point. At which point, politicians panicked. And in panicking, they imposed a rather draconian form of command and control on the U.S. economy. Some were free to work, and some weren't. Politicians were choosing this. And more still were free to work and operate their businesses within strict political limits. Political limits. I think that sentence needs to be repeated. Some were free to work, some weren't. And more still were free to work and operate their businesses within strict political limits. From freedom to central planning in a very small amount of time. At which point it's worth considering once again the simple pin factory that Smith witnessed in the 18th century versus the global cooperation that was the norm just 19 months ago. The supply lines of February 2020 were impossibly complicated structures that no politician could ever hope to design. A politician in his best day has no clue. Think billions of individuals around the world pursuing their narrow work specialization on the way to enormous global plenty. Put another way, the shelves in the economically free countries were heaving with all manner of products based on economic cooperation that was staggering in scope. Brilliant as some experts claim to be, and brilliant as most politicians think they are, and as they look in the mirror, they could never construct the web of trillions of economic relationships that prevailed before the lockdowns. But they could destroy the web, and they did. That, or they severely impaired it. In which case, let's please not insult reason by talking about shortages or inflation now. Let's instead be realistic and talk about central planning. We know from the 20th century that when politicians, authoritarians, or both substitute their intensely narrow knowledge, Jose Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher, talked quite a bit about this. You may want to look that up. Their intensely narrow knowledge that for the marketplace, that immense want for very little and lousy supply is the logical result. Let me read that again. We know from the 20th century that when politicians, authoritarians, or both substitute their intensely narrowly knowledge for that of the marketplace, that immense want for very little supply is the logical result. Yes, it is. When we were not economically free, bare shelves. When we're not economically free, bare shelves are the inevitable results. When we're not economically free, bare shelves will be the inevitable result. Conversely, product and service abundance is a certain consequence, yet again, of the infinite actions and trillions of economic relationships entered by billions of people. These commercial tie-ups were constructed by consenting individuals over many years and many decades, only for them to be wrecked by a political class arrogantly seeking to protect us from ourselves. That's what happens when command and control replaces voluntary order. Another important sentence. That's what happens when command and control replaces voluntary order. The remunerative ties that bind us fray or vanish altogether. The remunerative ties that bind us fray or vanish altogether. Consenting profitable economic activity was suddenly illegal. Yes, in the United States, politicians made economic activity illegal. Yet politicians and other experts are only now wringing their hands about a lack of supply. Really, what did they think was going to happen? While politicians couldn't ever create or legislate billions working together around the world, they could and can surely break voluntary economic arrangements. When you have guns, handcuffs, the power to quite literally shut off power sources to the productive, not to mention the wealth produced by the productive, you have the power to impose command and control. And we all know how politicians love command and control. And so they did. Only for the supply chain, painstakingly created in self-interested but spontaneous form over many decades, to suddenly break apart. Just don't call it inflation or shortages. Inflation is the devaluation of the unit of account. In our case, it's the devaluation of the dollar. And while Treasury hasn't always done a great job as the dollar steward over the decades, that's just the point. Devaluation was a routine problem in the 70s. It ceased to be in the 80s and 90s, but it reared its ugly head once again during the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s. To say inflation is a now thing is to ignore that it's more realistically been a 21st century long thing. We don't suddenly have an inflation problem. To say we do is the equivalent of saying that the Soviets had inflation because all the goods worth getting were both difficult to find and incredibly expensive if they could be found. In our case, we've had a lockdown problem. Care of nail-biting politicians that suffocated commercial cooperation around the world, and with work divided less than it used to be, care of government force, productivity is naturally lower than it used to be. Please consider modern productivity in terms of Smith's pin factory example yet again, and ask what it would do to supply. The only thing is supply shortfalls are not evidence of inflation. A rise in one price due to a lack of supply implies a fall in other prices. Yes, we have a central planning problem. Were he around today, Adam Smith could diagnose this in seconds. I think it's a brilliant article. I think this really shows you what happens when we think that government knows better. When the politicians try to tell us, listen to us, we can fix this, we have a handle on this, we'll guide you out of this. The worst thing that could ever happen to this country is for the politicians to continue to gain power. Politicians are clueless. It's like a relief pitcher in baseball. not so much recently, but in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. You know who was the relief pitcher in baseball? The failed starter. The guy who couldn't cut it as a starting pitcher. You know what politicians are today? The failed businessman, the failed entrepreneur, the failed scholar. That's who most politicians. I'm not going to paint the broad brush on everyone. That's what most politicians are. The failed component of society. They can't get out of their own way. They can't make a living doing anything other than leeching off the government teat. They can't make a living other than leeching off taxpayer dollars. Then today we see Joe Biden come out there at 12 o'clock and start pontificating about how his $1.75 trillion relief package is going to be the equivalent of the New Deal by FDR, the JFK stimulus of the economy, which, by the way, the JFK stimulus of the economy was lowering taxes and trickle-down economy. The first trickle-down economy president was John F. Kennedy. Let's not forget that. Biden is the epitome of this article by Adam Smith. He is an innate, not an intelligent person. He has no common sense, and he is fully and completely self-serving. People, this article is brilliant. This article hits the nail on the head, and this article tells us we don't have inflation. We don't have supply chain shortages. What we have is brain drain in our politics. And we keep voting these people in. Do not vote. Do not vote for these Democrat left-wing liberals. They are leading us down the path of an inferno, an economic inferno. They are leading us into following the footsteps of the collapse of the Russian economy, the collapse of Venezuela, the collapse of Cuba. That's what they're leading us down. Okay, I hope that you get a chance to read the article. I did the best I could reading it to you. I think it conveyed the message well. And let's keep the pressure on. Let's keep these politicians, let's vote these guys out. They got to go. Biden has to go. And Kamala, we know, is just a non-factor. She couldn't, I don't think she would do well running the Dade County Animal Shelter. She's clueless. And all his administration, I don't know if you've heard the congressional hearings, but his administration is just, this Merrick Garland guy, that's an embarrassment. And his appointees, all his appointees, they just go up there and just lie and avoid and don't answer questions. And it's got to end, people. It's got to end, because this is America. This is America. And I hope that you see this. Thank you. Have a good night.